Happy Halloween week, everybody. Welcome all into the unofficial WCC Hoops podcast. Thomas and I are coming off of the high of WCC Media Day last Thursday. Got to see all the coaches, the players, our fellow media members, commissioners, like everybody under the sun from the WCC. It was a lot of fun to be out there in Las Vegas. We'll recap a little bit. We'll get into Tyon Grant-Foster. We'll get into what some of the other exhibitions we started to see over the weekend. So definitely some interesting notes to take from there. We'll talk also a little bit about the scariest things about each of the 12 teams going into the season. Obviously, we're only a week away from the first real games. So we'll start to dive into that a little bit. But first, we are going to talk a little bit about, well, what we learned from Media Day. And because there was, I think, a lot of good things. There were some interesting notes to take from what we heard in Las Vegas. And Thomas, I'll start with you. I know we recapped it a little bit at the very end of the live stream. If you haven't watched the live stream or the interviews, go back and watch on YouTube and go look for the team you're looking for and everything else. But Thomas, from what we heard at Media Day, now that you've had a few days to sit on it, think about it, what are now the takeaways you have?
I think to start with, as you mentioned, coming off the high of Media Day, now Zach and I are in our big cosplay. Zach, obviously pirating up me. I know the lower third kind of blurs it out a little bit, but once that goes away, you'll see my Broncos script, Jalen Williams jersey, because I obviously am doing Thunderstruck 2 with Jalen Williams. But in terms of Media Day and what I learned, I think it's usually one of the easiest things to do, so to speak, in terms of like talking about your team, seeing what you like and all that. I think there was a renewed energy pretty much from every single team that we faced. I think there's always in the past, there's always a team's like, man, I don't know how it's going to go. But like you get down to even what our projected lower third of the conference is, we're talking to Portland, Pepperdine, USD, Pacific, and at no point were they discouraged about their prospects. They understand that there's a tall mountain to climb, but they think that they're fully capable of doing so. They think they're capable of making more noise than they did last year. And I think more than anything, they're not just a rollover night for any big team coming on the road in conference. It's going to take the requisite effort to beat those teams. And I can totally see the vision for what they're going for. And I think it's important to bring that type of energy even to a Media Day, because you give off the wrong impression. You give off an impression that you're not don't have a lot of faith in your team. I think it becomes pretty noticeable over the course of your time talking to the media. And I thought that these teams passed with flying colors, which is just kind of what you have to do. It's nothing that sort of stands out, but you pass the first smell test.
Yeah, and I think there was one of the teams that was maybe the stark difference between a year ago and this year was, at least for me, was Pacific. The way Dave Smart talked about his team, just like his energy level a year ago, you could tell he did not have the team he wanted. He still knew that there was a lot of work left to do to construct a roster the way he wanted. And this year, you could just see like how much more positive and how much more excitement he had about the group he is bringing in this year. He talked about it. He had a whole summer to actually recruit. He had more time to really think about the roster, who he was able to bring back, obviously the Elias Ralphs of the world, but then also who they were able to bring in, TJ Wainwright, Casey Mbekwe. He was really high on it. Casey Mbekwe can play to his ceiling. The fact that he said like, oh, I don't think we can just be better than we were a year ago. We could actually be really good. I think does say something for someone who, even though he's relatively still new to American college basketball, this is someone who's not unfamiliar with success at the highest levels. And so hearing him say that, and then not, again, to your point, not the only one. Portland was really kind of positive about the way they were going about their offseason, even though everybody, including us, have not been kind of putting Portland to bed already, and we haven't even played a single game, but they are out to not prove everyone wrong, but to prove themselves right, that they do belong with everybody else. That was something that Jermaine Balasegar-Webb mentioned to us in that Media Day interview, that this is a team that they know they're talented. There's a lot of unknowns still, but they feel like they're in a better spot at the start of this year than they were a year ago, which again, like, that was a team that did really start to roll it off at the end of the year last year. So we've talked a little bit about that lower half, but also even from the top components of the conference. I mean, there's a lot of different things to look at. Obviously, with Gonzaga, Tyon Grant-Foster is a huge deal of like how the Zags are going to play this year, and we will get into a little bit about where the legal situation for him is, because as we are recording on Monday, there will be something happening this afternoon that will turn the tide one way or another. But St. Mary's, I thought it was very telling that I think we all assumed that Harry Wessels was going to be the outright starter, was going to be the very clear number one at the center spot. He's the only senior on that team. And Randy Bennett kind of made it clear. It's like, I don't think it's as clear as we all thought it was. Andrew McKeever being right there in the mix. He started for the second straight exhibition in the Ole Miss game over the weekend. So I think there's some really interesting revelations that came out of Media Day. Obviously, nothing that means much of anything outside of like, you can hear the confidence, you can see just where some question marks are with these teams. But we're going to see real fast with games starting in a week.
Yeah, I mean, it's the time's ticking. It's getting to be that time. We got 11 of 12 teams starting next week over the course of next Monday and Tuesday. And I think you look at the top half, we obviously had our own questions for Gonzaga, St. Mary's, USF, Santa Clara. And I think, in parts they really assuaded those because I asked Mikey Lewis, how are the guards looking? Because there's a point guard role that needs to be filled. You asked Randy Bennett about it, and Mikey Lewis had a sense of, calmness about him, saying, that we have a bunch of guys who can step up and do a bunch of different things. Josh Dent, himself, Tony Duckett. There are a bunch of different little guys who can get it done, and that's not even including some of the youngsters waiting in tow if they get some spot minutes. So I like that. Gonzaga, they seem pretty in tune with who they are. I mean, why wouldn't you be, considering how good they are and the standard that they uphold pretty much every year? And I think it goes without saying the confidence Chris Gerlison has in his team, but knows that there's still a lot of work to do. Obviously, we'll get into some of the scrimmages later on in this episode, but I like where they're at. I like the way they're kind of filling the roster out in terms of people just can dabble in a little bit of everything. And Santa Clara in the same vein, like now with big time injuries in Garrett Normand and Chris Tadjo, how do they pick themselves off the mat and get themselves going off on the right foot early? Because it's not like they have a super easy schedule out of the break.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the challenges. I mean, again, injuries always happen in the course of the preseason, and that now for Santa Clara, two huge ones. So it's going to probably hurt them early on, especially when you talk about the potential that this team could have had, especially when you add Derry Darlin into that mix of what that group is going to be. Obviously, they're really high on him. And so were all the coaches too, because he was the only non-returner to make the WCC all preseason team. And there were a lot of familiar names on that preseason team. No one was really shocked to see kind of the Graham Ekes, the Braden Huffs, Mikey Lewis, Paulus Morauskas, Tyrone Riley, Ryan Beasley. I mean, so many familiar names on that list for the preseason team. So I think it's also one of those things when you go into a media day like this, especially in today's college basketball, no one knows much of anything because there's half the league with a brand new roster. I mean, really, you look anywhere down from Santa Clara and on south in the preseason poll, a ton of brand new players. Like Santa Clara, brand new. Oregon State, brand new. Washington State, brand new. LMU, Seattle, San Diego, Pacific. Continue down the list. Almost everyone had to almost have a full reset on the roster, maybe with a few returners here and there, but it's almost like it is a first day of school. It is a returning of just getting to know everybody again, because we don't really know what we're going to see and how these teams are going to gel. The one team I will say that I thought was maybe the best, was the most fun group of media day, I thought was the San Diego Toreros. I thought that group was really fun. They felt really connected with each other. And this is a team that also brand new, but it seems the optimism is there with this group again. A year ago, we were looking at a team that really just looked like it was put together with some scotch tape and hopes and prayers. But this team actually does feel like a group that can do something. And they're a veteran group, which is different from a year ago. They have a little bit more oomph behind them as far as the way the roster is constructed. That was, to me, like San Diego was one that did stand out. And we talk about, again, all the others. Pacific stood out. I thought Portland stood out, and San Diego, another one that stands out amongst the others.
And I think it's cool that you referenced that's the one you flew solo on, and much like in the same vein with Pepperdine and myself, I think San Diego, I'm much in agreement within the boat that they do have a lot more talent, especially on the floor, because I think you saw last year where things got tough and the bottom kind of just fell out, so to speak, and it was just hard for Steve Lavin and company to kind of just recollect themselves throughout last season. Going into this year, obviously, we didn't get to see him at Media Day, but Adrian McIntyre is the guy that stands out to me. How does he make that transition? And I think going forward, it's like, how does San Diego kind of deal with their first set of adversity? Because while we do think that this is a team that is much better, and I certainly expect them to be better, it's one thing to talk about it. And as with all the rest of the other 11 teams, it's another thing to experience in-game adversity and actually react to it in real time.
Well, speaking of adversity, we are going to start talking about Tyon Grant-Foster and the situation he has with the injunction hearing here on Monday in Spokane County. So as of last week, like going into Thursday, the NCAA was urging that this case be taken to federal court, that this was not something that a local jurisdiction should be handling, and that was rejected by a federal judge. And so this was kicked back to Spokane County. And so now Tyon Grant-Foster's injunction hearing will take place on Monday. The interesting note, if you go and look from this, is that the judge involved in this case also happens to be a Gonzaga law grad. So there is this interesting note about who will be deciding on whether the injunction is going to be put into place. And if the injunction is put into place, that means that Grant-Foster will be eligible to play. And Gonzaga has a game tonight against Western Oregon. Their first, I believe, is their first exhibition of the year. So he could go straight from the courtroom to the court. So he could very well much have his uniform on underneath and go straight to the kennel right after he's done at the courthouse. But it feels like we are finally going to get what should have been the decision long ago, that this is something that he should have been allowed to play months and months ago.
To start with, and I don't know if the Spokane County Court will allow this, but I hope the Gonzaga creative team is somewhere in the vicinity, because we could get a moment where Tyon, takes off whatever he's wearing at court and then just has the Zags uniform on underneath. I would like that a lot. Get the actual, oh my God, here it comes, breaking news, kind of like a WWE style entrance. So I'd want to see that just for my personal sake and entertainment sake. But yeah, I do agree. He should be playing it. I think, like I mentioned in the live stream episode during Media Day, it was one thing where what I thought a few months ago is not the same what I think now. I think once I've actually gathered all the facts, context, and information, kind of making a decision of where I land on this, I think it's pretty clear that Tyon has earned the year at Gonzaga. I know obviously people are going to point to the age right away, but just look at his story, look at his journey, what he's gone through. That's a tough stack of cards. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about that. So I think it'll be cool to see if he gets that injunction approved, and I would like to see him out there. It does change the calculus for Gonzaga, and well, again, we're going to talk about what that means basketball wise here in a bit. But I think for no matter what, the addition of Tyon Grant-Foster would be a welcome one, not only for Gonzaga but for the WCC and their swan song.
Now that's one thing we talked a little bit about that at Media Day with Gonzaga assistant coach Brian Michelson. Because this was a difficult situation. And you asked the question, because you think about planning for a season, planning for what your roster is going to look like. You didn't know whether Grant-Foster was even going to be on the roster.
And you can't just plug in a practice player and say, yep, you're Tyon Grant-Foster. Now let's go do what we do.
Exactly. He's such a unique player to what Gonzaga has on the current roster that there really wasn't a sub in. There wasn't someone who could just slide in and then be that guy. They needed someone who was going to they had to plan this out very strangely. It's almost like here's the way we would run the entire offense without him. Here's the way we would run the entire offense with him. And that goes both ways. It's like defensively too. It's like, here's what we are capable of defensively with him, and then here's what we are capable of without him. And having the game plan of without him in your back pocket for weeks, months in the preseason was not a difficult thing to do. And so we'll play the clip where we talked to Brian Michelson. He explains a little bit about this and what it meant for the Zags as they were going through the preseason.
Obviously, one of the big things that is happening with Tyon Grant-Foster, we won't get into the legal part of that, but in terms of basketball and for coach, how do you even plan to because he's here, he's not here. How do you kind of substitute or we'll run this if he's here, we'll run this if he's not here? How do you even make sense of planning basketball related things and schemes with or without him?
That's a great question because it is something we've wrestled with. We've had these guys now with the way the schedule works. We had these guys all summer, and they were incredible. And we went through our usual summer program and kind of in the back of our mind had some thoughts on what it might look like if he arrived in the fall, both offensively and defensively. Then we had a couple weeks stretch where he was integrated, and we were trying to get him up to speed kind of on what we had been doing. And now, it's back to a point where it's not with us anymore. He's not with us. And so it's more hypothetical, I think. I think it's, this might look good. This is what it might look like. But, that exhibition game the other night, obviously played without him, didn't have him in the rotation. You're not just trying to figure out the X's and O's. You're trying to figure out which groups play well together, which lineups function best offensively or defensively. And that's, as hard as any of the X's and O's is we haven't got to have our lineups out there yet and kind of look what that looks like, which is what you would hope to use those exhibitions for. So it's definitely made for a unique process, a complicated process. I've been here 25 years and between injuries and NCAA stuff, there's probably only been one or two times in my career that we've had something like this with the uncertainty this deep into the season.
You can obviously see just the challenge that the Gonzaga Bulldogs have gone through when it comes to trying to game plan with and without him. Obviously, we'll know one way or the other tonight exactly how this is going to go. I'd imagine because every person who is much smarter about the legal process than either of us are thinking that this is going to get resolved today. So we'll keep an eye out, and obviously there will be an update later on Monday to see whether Tyon Grant-Foster is able to get the injunction pushed through and he's able to play some basketball.
Absolutely. And I think it's cool to get in the mind of a coach because, as much as we like and respect Mark Few, I'm not sure we would have gotten that type of technical answer from him, but I think it's cool to see what Brian Michelson was kind of wrestling with because a lot of the assistant coaches, they're responsible for game plans and schemes. And, coaches have a lot more of CEO type stuff nowadays. So cool to kind of work the mind, pick the brain of someone who's a very astute coach and has a lot of playing experience as well. And kind of seeing how Gonzaga can be at their best. So I think it was cool to kind of get just a little bit of an inkling as to what exactly the dynamics are right now.
Now, the one thing where we can start to talk about is as Gonzaga will be playing an exhibition tonight, a number of other teams also started playing exhibitions over the weekend. We talked a little bit about some of those last week, what those matchups started to look like, but we had a few. So Washington State took on New Mexico, USF, and Utah State. St. Mary's had Ole Miss, and Santa Clara had Cal. I know I'm missing a couple of them, but we think these four games, I think they each presented kind of a different challenge for each of the teams. For Washington State, it was an opportunity for them to kind of prove that there's a little bit of proof to the pudding, that this is a team that needed to gel pretty quickly. And what they were going to do for St. Mary's, I think coming off the Arizona game, it was seeing if there was an improvement. What can you take from game 1 to game 2? What got better? What could they still improve upon? And are the rotations starting to be a little bit crisper than they were just last week? For USF, I think it's kind of a little bit more proof in the pudding. We kind of know what USF is going to look like for the most part. So it's a matter of whether or not a lot of those new pieces how they were going to fit, how they were going to keep up. And then for Santa Clara, and honestly, again, we talked about a little bit about the injuries. How do they overcome the injuries early on? And with so many new pieces, how do they kind of overcome that? And Thomas, I'll start with you. Like, with what you've heard about what Santa Clara went through against Cal, what's maybe some of the takeaways you can at least like go off of based on the fact that there's no video, there's no stat box, and just getting like the little notes that we've been receiving.
Yeah, I think the big thing is that there's going to be a like forged in the fire adjustment period, because we know thanks to me today that Garrick Normand and Chris Todjo are going to be out for quite some time. So it's not like these new guys who are both the new faces in terms of transfers, but new faces in terms of rising freshmen, like they're going to get put in the fire right away. And it doesn't get, there's not really a, so to speak, easy start for the Broncos. They obviously are, McNeese is a new team, but they still obviously have a lot of winning pedigree. Xavier on the road, that's not easy. So just the look of what these few types of games are to start with, I think it's a big time deal to find out who's ready to kind of own their opportunity. And I look at a guy like Alan Graves, I think Jake Ensminger, they both got chances, to really make something happen. And when I look at the scrimmage against Cal, obviously no two of the big transfers. If I'm not mistaken, Napper also did not play in that scrimmage. So while Cal is not going to be what I would argue they won't be in the top half of the ACC, I still think it would have been probably a little bit nicer to see that Santa Clara could have overcome this. But I do think it's not necessarily sound the alarms, because once again, it's just a closed door scrimmage of which we don't have the stat box or anything like that. But more than anything, I think it provides enough opportunity for other guys to kind of take more reps in higher roles that they may not necessarily have been expecting in recent memory. And I think it's, for someone like Elijah Mahi, the focus is now strictly on him. So how does he deal with that because of all the other guys who are no longer alongside him, in the starting lineup and such? So that's kind of how I kind of take stock of it with Santa Clara. Not doom and gloom yet, but I do think it rises to the theme of, and what eventually I'll talk about when we talk about the scaries later on in the show. But what happens in adjusting on the fly with the injuries, the lack of experience, and not necessarily the easiest start to your season.
Yeah, and now I think there's something to be said when you talk about like maybe a little bit of the scaries about what Santa Clara has. I think what we saw from USF, or sorry, not USF, I was going to start with Washington State, is maybe some positive. Like the Cougars came out, and I thought like they looked really good against a New Mexico team that they did end up beating. They won that game 74-66. Take that for what it is. A few positives. They shot 54% in that first half. You got Emmanuel Ugbo with 16-7. Andy Okafor 9-14-2. Great line for him. He was one of the guys we saw at Media Day. But some things to work on. I mean, they shot 28% in the second half. They were only 5 of 22 from 3. So still shaking off some of those cobwebs. We talked a little bit about it with David Riley at Media Day. Just like this team is going to be a little bit different on the way it's going to look, because this isn't quite the run and gun team that we saw last year with guys that he was ultimately familiar with, because they all came over from Eastern Washington with him. And I don't think they have quite the shooters that they did a year ago, but it's a different look and feel to this team. I think there's going to be a grittier team. There's going to be a team that's going to grind it a little bit more. And I think that's going to match WCC a little bit better when you think about what you have to do against the top teams in this league. You have to be able to rebound. You have to be able to play solid defense down low, and you have to take care of the basketball. And I think that was another thing that Washington State really did not do well last year. And that's something else that they're going to have to work on. And in this game, like they still turned it over quite a bit in this game, but I think there was definitely some positives to take from a matchup with another really good mid-major team.
And it helps like bring into focus the essential question that I've had over the last few months, and seeing how David Riley's brought in a lot more toughness on this team. You mentioned Emmanuel Ugbo, and I think rightfully so. That's kind of where I would start with my point as well. The big question for me within that was, did they course correct too far, so much that they can't play the David Riley system that we've come to know, both at Eastern Washington and now at Washington State? So that was like one of the questions I wanted to see answered over the course of the season. How does it kind of look in terms of calibrating correctly for the Cougars and trying to make sure that system is flowing as well as can be? I think a good start. And obviously, you mentioned those numbers. Washington State better in the toughness department, still shooting that's left to be desired. But once again, it is just an exhibition, just a scrimmage. It will not count in terms of, O stats and all that. And against the New Mexico team that has been to the tournament the last few, or been in tournament contention and made the tournament the last few seasons. Obviously, new head coach on their side as well with Eric Olin coming from UCSD. I think in general, it's a net positive for Washington State. I do think for me, it's not necessarily about a one-game sample size, but what they do over a larger sample size, because we saw last year, I think they were 13-3 at one point, and then obviously it was just like a steady, and then the bottom eventually fell out. So kind of just see what happens over the first 10 games or so, take stock of their season, at least for me, that how I view it is I look at it in terms of chapters and see how Washington State does in each chapter. How does it build off one another, and how do they stay consistent over the course of said chapters?
Yeah, and obviously, we will see how Washington State continues to grow throughout the course of the preseason and into the non-conference. St. Mary's also had another matchup over the weekend. This time they went down to Mississippi to take on Ole Miss in their exhibition. And this one, unlike the game against Arizona, this is one St. Mary's really kind of had control of from the beginning, it looked like. They ended up winning 68-53. They were plus 20 on the rebounding front. So that sounds like a very St. Mary's like game, keeping teams in the 50s, pounding them into the ground on the glass. Morauskas 21, Lewis 20. Andrew McKeever getting the start again. 2 for 2. He has been getting the starts. And obviously we talked a little bit about that at Media Day of like what the role of Andrew McKeever is going to be. It really does seem that this is going to be more of a 50-50 split, at least as of right now, between McKeever and Wessels, which I think, at least I was probably under the impression going into the year, we're probably going to look closer to 65-35, 70-30 on the Wessels front. But it really now seems like it is a tight race at the center position, which I think a number of people around the WCC are going to raise some eyebrows about. When you think about the center spot, and maybe again, like some of the stability that St. Mary's has had over the years, like this, if Harry Wessels is then not the starter, you're really kind of looking at almost four brand new bodies that are going to be in that starting lineup all the time, or like getting heavy minutes. Randy Bennett even said top 6 in the rotation. Andrew McKeever is going to be in there no matter what.
Yeah, it was surprising to me when I heard that he was ready last year more than anything. And I think this year I wouldn't rule out seeing the double big lineup early. I think that's kind of like one of the other things you mentioned, kind of like the split and McKeever relieving Wessels. I think we should consider, obviously, with the way McKeever is starting in some of these scrimmages, that we won't see the double big lineup pretty early. I think that's something that should absolutely be on the table. I know it was brought in more later towards the latter parts of last season, but I think Randy Bennett, knows that it's something that can be deployed now. I think that's the one thing. If McKeever is as ready as Bennett says he is, and we've seen Wessels kind of step up in limited opportunity, and now he has a bigger opportunity and bigger runway, I'd be intrigued to see that lineup early. And I know it's something that I think St. Mary's is going to have to wrestle with in terms of their identity, because Morauskas obviously played a lot at the 4 last year. This would really shift them up there to the 3, and what would already be a big lineup considering we expect Mikey Lewis to start. So I think it's a real juxtaposition in terms of what St. Mary's wants to do identity-wise. But I do think, obviously, more than two capable centers, and Wessels and McKeever. It's interesting to see how they get deployed. Whether it's a platoon or an actual they go into battle together.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I think we're going to see that double big. I don't think there's a question about seeing that double big rotation, especially when you think about how successful it was last year with Saxon and Wessels in there. So Wessels can obviously do it. You throw in McKeever, and then you go even bigger. We'll note that St. Mary's did update the official roster, so Andrew McKeever is now listed as taller than Harry Wessels. So
okay, so I remember we went over this. McKeever was listed at 7'1", but what was Wessels also listed at?
7'1".
Okay, now what are they?
McKeever's now listed at 7'2".
Okay.
He gained an inch.
Magically did that.
But thinking about just that, that combination, that the fact that McKeever is ready now, was ready a year ago, obviously it always speaks to the development process that the St. Mary's team has, especially with big men, because it always seemed like they just roll through big men one after the next after the next. It's like there's never a break on the just the solid play of big men in this program. I mean, before Mitchell Saxon, you had Matthias Toss. Like, you go back further, like you had Jock Landale. Like, you can continue to just go further and further back on just big men. It's like, it's very rare when you think about a St. Mary's team that doesn't have that legitimate center who's going to be an all-league type player year in and year out.
Yeah, I think you look at everything in terms of where these teams kind of grow over the course of the season. You look at the way everything that kind of the deck of cards is laid out. I think all those little pinpoints and all those little opportunities and kind of the situation you're just mentioning right there. Just think of all the different opportunity that all these different teams have, especially at the top of the contendership that we dub, so to speak. So I look at it and I'm like, I'm excited for it, and I'm ready to intrigued to see how it plays out.
All right, so one more, USF and Utah State. There was another exhibition. This was one that went Utah State's direction. Utah State is now 2-0 against the WCC. They also beat Seattle last week. Not for nothing about exhibition basketball, but USF, I mean, this was a team, obviously they're still working on some things as well. It's like, we know about Ryan Beasley, we know about Tyrone Riley, we know about Barry Wang, we know about Venu Abosi. Like, we know about some of the pieces on this squad, but we needed to know about Legend Smiley. We needed to know about Mookie Cook. We needed to know about David Fuchs. We needed to know about Guillermo Diaz-Graham. Like, there's a lot of pieces that still need to kind of find their way. And Utah State obviously is a really good team. Like, that's a team that's going to be in the mix in the Mountain West. That's a team that's going to be probably knocking on the door of an at-large bid again, as USF is also going to be doing the same. I'm a negative result. Obviously, you don't look too much into that one. And with this one, it just felt like they just need to get out there and go. Give USF just some run time. Just let them go, because I have full faith that by the time we actually start playing real games next week, that Chris Gerlofson's going to have these guys ready to go, and this ship is going to look really good once it starts rolling.
Fully in agreement on that. And I looked at some of the USF forums to see what they were taking away from the scrimmage, but it really just came down to shooting. USF didn't shoot the ball well in the second half, and that's just kind of where it doomed himself, both on the interior and from the perimeter. So kind of a game where I think, from what I read, it felt like Mookie Cook was pressing, just something where you obviously want to make a big impression, being one of the transfers that you were courted the most by USF and coming from Oregon. And Vukasin Masic, obviously going through a tough time, as Chris Gerlofson mentioned in our live stream at Media Day, and our condolences to the Masic family. But I think going forward, there's a little more of an acclimation period that I think we gave credit for in terms of USF. But I do think they'll be fine. I think it's, at the end of the day, I know the objective of basketball is to make shots, but when I look at this, it's like, it's just shooting. I think they'll be fine. I think more than anything, I think you want to see a little more from Tyrone Riley. I think Ryan Beasley's doing fine, with the more adjustments as people look at him in terms of being an on-ball creator and having the ball in his hand a lot more. And I think we're going to see more of David Fuchs than we were initially giving credence for. I think that's the one thing I'm looking at. I'm saying maybe he's really the main answer, so to speak, in terms of down on the block. Because I think we both have floated the idea that he will be a reinforcement, but I think potentially he could be the reinforcement.
Yeah, he was actually higher on my list. It was kind of funny to me, like, that he wasn't being as mentioned as much. Obviously, Guillermo Diaz-Graham was getting a lot of the attention because, like, he has like the look, like he has 7 foot, like he can shoot. It's like he can do a lot of those things, but they needed the toughness. They needed someone who's going to bang inside, and David Fuchs was the one that gave them that. So I'm glad you mentioned him, because like he's the one that, like, I feel like is probably the bigger key for USF, because they need to be physical inside against the likes of the St. Mary's, a Santa Clara, in Oregon State, a Gonzaga. That's the one thing that if you look at USF, that's kind of the one area where they are missing a bit. So the fact that like he's going to be a big part of that is huge. But how about like things that are potentially scary about each of these teams? And I think we have to kind of go through each of these squads and just kind of talk about who scares you about which team. And I'm gonna throw it out there as we're on USF, and I'll start with USF, because I think the scary thing about USF is not necessarily the front court, because I think, again, I have enough faith in this coaching staff to be able to figure it out, and I think it's just more a scary thing on the upside. The scary part to me on the upside is if Ryan Beasley can stay healthy, what is this team capable of doing? Because we have seen the glimpses. When he starts to get on a roll, when he really starts to be that offensive, like, key centerpiece for USF, this team has looked really good. Chris Gerlison even mentioned it at Media Day. It's like, I think he brought up one of the games where he scored like 18 points in 20 minutes, and he's like, dumb coach for not keeping him in or keeping him in or starting him more often. But that's the sort of thing of like, if he can stay healthy, and I know that's been a problem year one. That was a problem last year where he didn't get really into a rhythm until middle conference play. If he can hit the ground running, keep it going, this USF team is not only capable of getting to an NCAA tournament, this team is capable of doing damage in the NCAA tournament. And so I think, like, for USF, the scary thing to me is Ryan Beasley just completely balling out that on the high side.
You know, I like that you brought that up because I didn't give a lot of thought to that. So I think it's a pretty valid take. And now when I look at, obviously the Chase Center injury, not his fault, but it kind of just happened. But I like what you mentioned in terms of the lead up to that and the context surrounding, when Ryan Beasley's been in and out of the lineup. I think, obviously the more he's there, the better USF is. And I think, like you mentioned, if he's there, I love it. We both have talked about how much we want to put this USF team in the top 2. We have to wait till they actually do it to actually, do that in the future. But we were both very close, I know, to doing so. And we wanted to find a reason, for lack of a better phrase, but we just couldn't.
If Ryan Beasley stays healthy and he can show what he does what we think he's capable of doing all year long, top 2 is in the cards. But USF without him, not a chance.
No, I 100% agree, and that's kind of like it leads me into some of more like the injury talk, and at least for me with Santa Clara, like the injuries and experience. I talked about it earlier with the way in their scrimmage against Cal. Different guys now have different roles compared to what they had a month ago. And when you look at already Santa Clara having to deal with more, like this is the most that they've had to reset in a long time. And when you look at the way they tried to recruit, the way they've tried to kind of find more diamonds in the rough, there's not a whole lot of like known firepower yet. I know Thierry Darlin's probably going to be the guy that everyone's kind of looking at right now. But when I look at everything else, no Normand, no Tadjo, Napper obviously didn't play in that scrimmage. What does everybody else look like in that role? Because I mentioned I compared Alan Graves to Cam Tung. Maybe he might have to be a little more than that. Jake Ensminger does a great job on the intangibles and does the dirty work. Is he ready for more of an offensive load? Elijah Mahi, people are going to be picking him up potentially at half court if he's going to be handling the ball a little bit. Can he find a way to stay conditioned correctly and still find a way to finish those layups late in the game? So when I look at Santa Clara, for me, what concerns them the most is the ability to maneuver and stay consistent within that. Can Herb Sendek find the right chess pieces, put them in the right spots, and then can Santa Clara not have a flat tire early in the season? Obviously, last year with North Dakota State, a few seasons ago at Portland, at home against San Diego. These are games that Santa Clara has to win if they want to get to the NCAA tournament. And I think that's the one thing. It's not necessarily about their peak. It's about their floor. Can they find a way to not trip themselves up? And when I look at this year, the maneuverability that they're going to have to enact to kind of beat that trend is something that's really going to be tough to do. And it's my biggest question for them.
I mean, you bring up consistency. You bring up just trying to find that rhythm. I mean, a team that obviously, like, the scariest thing about LMU is almost the same thing. It is the consistency, and it's whether or not they can find the offense enough. Because I feel like the thing that scared me, like the other night when they had their exhibition against USC, I should say, was the shooting. That first half, they shot 10%. That's like, that is ridiculous. That is unheard of. I mean, talking just like with Stan Johnson, it's like, he's like, can't even explain that one. Like that one, like you shoot 10%. That's difficult to do. You have to try to shoot 10%.
We could do that.
Like, yeah, we could definitely do that. But I think the consistency of this LMU team is another one of, like, that is a scary proposition. This is a team that I think has to get off to a good start. They have to figure it out early on. And the schedule is not a murderer's row by any stretch. This is a team that should, I should say they are capable of probably getting 9-10 wins in the preseason. They are fully capable of it. But how close are they going to get to that number? Are they going to end up closer to 7? Will they end up with 8? Will be further down than that, because they do have some good ones later on. They have St. Louis, they have UC San Diego. They will play Florida Atlantic. They do have UC Santa Barbara. Not like there aren't bad teams on the schedule all the way through, but can they do enough by the time they see those teams to be consistent enough to pull off those wins? We know by the time they got to December a year ago, they beat Nevada. Like they figured it out later on, but can they turn that on sooner so that by the time they get to these better teams, they're in a bit of a rhythm and they can do what we at least on paper think they're capable of?
Yeah, we look at LMU. I think the answer always starts, continues, and stops with the floor of the team. Where can they find a way to continue to establish going from point A to point B to point C and not have a side quest along the way, so to speak. So I look at them. I think it's a valid argument. It's a valid assessment. I think it's one of the only assessments that you can make about LMU. The more consistent they can be, the more of a contender they can be, and it's really their essential question. I look at consistency and I kind of mold that into another team. And the way we know they can be consistent on one end of the floor, but what are we going to see going on? And that's for me, is Seattle U and their offense. We know what they bring on defense. We know the tenacity. We know the fundamentals. We know the rebounding. We know they brought in a hell of a good transfer in Brock Felder, who has a chance to be Defensive Player of the Year in this conference. Like, let's make no bones about that. Brock Felder is someone who could absolutely win the Defensive Player of the Year award come this upcoming March. When I look at Seattle, we know what they're going to bring. They're a known quantity on that end. And I think there are somewhat similar arguments to sometimes with St. Mary's. Can the shooting not fail them? And last year they had a bit of a rough time shooting the basketball. And obviously the defense still keeping them in games. But if you're on the road, say, a historic Gale Coliseum against Oregon State, and you're in a bit of a bar fight, can you find those lasting shots to get over the top? Can you sneak a road win at LMU when the offense is not going well? Can the offense help rise up to the occasion and you get an upset road win at Santa Clara or something like that? So when I look at everything else along those lines in Seattle U, we are both bullish on them, and I think rightfully so. But I think that's because of the lead on defense. And we talked to Coach Victor, we talked to Braden Maldonado and Malik Arrington all about it. The offense is where I think the biggest difference comes for the Red Hawks and where the biggest difference maker is for them if they want to get to where they want to go.
So we're talking about teams we're bullish on, and I do want to pivot there because I do think that the other team we've been bullish on is Pacific. And I think maybe the scary thing here isn't necessarily has anything to do with what Pacific has been up to. It's not how they've recruited. It's not what they've been doing in practice. It's not the coaching staff. The scary thing about them might just be how, even though we might be bullish, there's maybe just this wave of underselling what Pacific has done and the underestimation of this team early on, because this is a team I think that is going to they're not going to be flashy about it, but they're going to sneak up on teams. They're going to drag teams into the mud. They're obviously a much better shooting team than they were a year ago. And this team is the scary team because they feel like they're the ones that can come out of nowhere, that they feel so unassuming. Pacific has not been much of a factor in a good number of years. And so you kind of forget that they can still do some damage. Now, obviously Washington State won't forget, but everyone else might.
Man, that's a stray right there, stray and a half.
Washington, they won't forget, but everyone else might just. It feels like a team that's you could potentially fall asleep at the wheel. Like, let's say again, like, I'm not to say that it'll happen to Santa Clara, but I think the week they play St. Mary's, they also play Pacific. So they could be focused so much on St. Mary's that they overlook Pacific, and got two teams catching strays in my soliloquy on Pacific. But I think Pacific is that team where it's like they can sneak up on you. And if you're not careful, that's the scary part about this Tiger team.
I think you talk about rising to the occasion. I think that's a big deal for Pacific, because it's one thing to go from blowout loss to a close loss or close game. Then how do they turn that around and turn that into close wins? And I think that's kind of like the essential argument. Dave Smart knows how to win. Now he's got to find a way to transition that into the WCC and teach his own players, aside from really Elias Ralph, who has his own barometer of success and has had success over his career. how to teach everybody else to win the West Coast Conference. And part of that is rising to the occasion. Another team that I think has to meet the moment and rise to the occasion, considering what we've talked about them, is San Diego. I think we look at them. We know there's a lot more talent in this building. We saw it in year one with Steve Lavin, and kind of like the little bit of noise that they were making even towards the WCC's tournament before they met their fate in the quarters against Santa Clara. We saw towards we saw guys with lots of talent, guys like Deuce Turner, obviously no longer there. Keon Kenzie, I thought had good talent. He's obviously no longer there. Kevin Patton Jr., no longer there. Now you return a guy in KJ Bradley, who I think is pretty good, probably one of the biggest microwaves in the conference. Now you added some other guys like Tyler Johnson. You added another bevy of guards in Adrian McIntyre. And then I look at San Diego. Can they find a way to kind of continue to have more of a force inside? Obviously, no Steven Jamerson anymore in there. But if San Diego has a little bit of a force inside, I think the better they are for it. But can they rise to the occasion with the talent that we've kind of dubbed on them? Because you mentioned you talked to San Diego, obviously, at Media Day, and your solo station, just like I did with Pepperdine. I think we agree San Diego's on the upward trend. They're going in the right direction. But can they meet the moment in doing so? Because I think it's one thing for us to talk about it. Another thing for them to go out and do it, and kind of how San Diego responds to with some of the returners last year. How do they make sure they don't fall into the trap of if things, if they have a rough patch early, it's not the, oh no, here we go again. It's the, okay, we're prepared for this and we can adjust, and then we can eventually go make some noise in the WCC.
Yeah, I mean, making noise with that sort of team, that sort of talent is going to be, it's a tough challenge, but it feels like that they're pointed in the right direction. I like that San Diego team. Now, one of the teams I think that you talk about, like that, I think it's like there's always a sense of like that they could be better than they are, maybe not, or like depending on who you ask, about Oregon State, because this is a team that looked really good in the non-conference. They looked really good in the first half of WCC play. But the one thing that has been a consistent mark against this team, and the scariest part about this team, is when they leave Gill Coliseum and they play on the road. They were 3-7 last year in true road games. They were 2-3 in neutral site games. This is a team that just, for whatever reason, just cannot put it together on the road. They like the mental lapses, whatever else, like, because there's such the difference between the way they play at home and the way they play on the road. And this is something they need to figure out. And it's something they need to figure out, not only obviously for the season, but you're going to be in the Pac-12 next season with a much better top to bottom league. And you better figure out how to win the road games now before you then have to hit the road and go to Boise, go to San Diego State, go to Fort Collins, go to Logan. Go to Logan. Like, you better figure out how to win on the road now before you have to be in these massive gyms on the road in the new Pac-12.
And Wayne Tinkle told us that that's still a work in progress. And yes, this is the month of October. Let's be very clear. What they are in now is not what going to be they are in late February, early March. But I do think it's notable that, yeah, we know it's a concern. They know it's a concern, and yet, the team is still trying to come together and figure it out. And I think we're going to see pretty early, with the way Oregon State has to go on the road pretty early, what the growth has been in that department. And I think when we look at a similar fate for a similar team, Washington State, they're going to the Pac-12 as well. They're going back. They have to learn how to win these road games just as much as the Beavers do. And for the Cougs, we talked about it earlier. Did they course correct enough, and did they do it correctly under David Riley when they faced some in-game toughness? Because last year, we mentioned 13-3 start. They looked amazing in the non-conference. They beat up Nevada on the road. They beat Boise State in a neutral site game. I know that's something even St. Mary's hasn't done in quite a while. Can Washington State find a way to continue to get themselves back on the right path and sustain the right path? Because last year we saw it. Once kind of the injuries started piling up, and then it's like you feel the weight on your shoulders and the weight on their backs. They kind of just fell flat and kind of let the moment consume them over the course of the rest of the season. And then notably, as you mentioned, against Pacific, those two games against the Tigers. For me, for the Cougs, it's about, can that toughness meet the system, and they meet together in the middle and find a way to be the best version of Washington State. I know our preseason rankings didn't necessarily reflect that, but I think that's something that goes kind of beyond where it goes beyond kind of like the box score and all that and the wins and the losses. I think it's more about the style of play and eventually what you see in the game, especially when it comes to close wins, close losses, blowout wins, blowout losses. What does Washington State and the perfect mix look like?
Yeah, exactly. And now now another team that's on the other end of the spectrum, I'm going to go to Portland, because for me, this Portland team, the challenge here, the scary thing about this team is where they're starting from, because they're starting from now. They are starting from a higher position and a better position than where they began a year ago, but it still feels to me that they are starting at a lower spot than maybe everyone else in the conference except for Pepperdine. And this is one of the challenges that Portland is going to have. It's like, okay, from starting point A, how much better can you get to point B? How much better can you get down the road? Because looking at this squad, I mean, this is a team that it's hard. Like, I feel like even though like they were ultra positive at media day, like I need to see it. I think we need to see whether or not this team can indeed improve quickly, and whether or not they actually are better on day one this year than they were on day one a year ago with almost an entirely new roster.
I think the same holds true for another team, like you already just mentioned, Pepperdine. I think for them, can they sustain the momentum that they had towards the end of last year? Can they make that not a flash in the pan? I asked Ed Schilling, Danilo Dozic, and Javon Cooley how they plan to do so, but they seem to think that they have found kind of a defensive identity and kind of a dog mentality that they need to kind of sustain and teach what it takes to win at Pepperdine. We mentioned the facilities that they're going to have in the next year with the Mountain and Mullen that's helping both basketball programs and the volleyball program. Can Pepperdine sustain that? Can they find a way to find new guys to understand what the old guard just did towards the end of last season, turn that into something better for themselves and punch up in this conference? Because obviously we don't think that Pepperdine and Portland are going to make as much noise, but they don't care what we have to say. I think they think that they can do so. And I want to see how they find a way to learn how to win with a lot of new players on the roster.
Yeah. And now going over to St. Mary's, the scariest part about this team is the mascot. The mascot is the scariest part of this team. Like maybe this, if you dressed up as that mascot out on Halloween, everyone would run in terror.
Come on, Gideon is fine.
Do you want to run into Gideon in a dark alley? I don't think so.
Okay, maybe I don't.
It's like, I'm just thinking of like that up light. If he's in the dark and like, nope, I'm out. If you run into Gideon in a dark alley, you are not coming out the dark alley.
Okay, fine. I'll give you that one.
But on the court, I think right now it's the point guard position. I think the point guard position is maybe the scariest thing right now, because we don't know who is going to fully step into that role. St. Mary's obviously has done a really good job of developing point guards over the years. So like maybe long term, that's not going to be a concern. Josh Dent, Mikey Lewis, whoever else is going to step into that. But right now, I think we're going to see we're going to see a transition. We're going to see some growing pains at that spot. And early on, so for St. Mary's fans, there are going to be ugly moments, I think. And it's just part of the process. Randy Bennett talked about this is kind of part of the process. Like Augustus Marcialonis was kind of this way a couple of years ago, like where he was still kind of learning through this thing. And at times it looked ugly. But this was someone who then turned into two-time player of the year. So point guard is like, if I'm looking at something scary for me going into the year, I got to look at the point guard spot.
And I think that holds same for the other big-time contender and the preseason favorite to win the conference in their last song in the Gonzaga Bulldogs. I think Brian Michelson, when we talked to him, was very adamant about the guard depth that they have. And I think we both agree with that. And I think the same assessment is true when we said Gonzaga has a lot of good guards, but who is great? Okay, we think Braden Smith is very capable, and I think so. And I think that's its own thing at point guard. But for me, it's the perimeter explosiveness. And obviously, we're recording this as Tyon Grant-Foster is going to have an injunction hearing. We'll put that off to the side for now. We know who he is. We know what he can bring to the table. But aside from that, for me, it's about the perimeter explosiveness. Is there enough shooting? Last year, obviously, the Zag shooting fell off a cliff at even uglier times. I'm not convinced that won't happen again in certain spurts. I'm not sure it's entirely fair to pin all of the Gonzaga three-point shooting on Steel Venters. I know Adam Miller's been an improving shooter over at Arizona State, but his numbers have kind of been on a little bit of a roller coaster when you look into the details of that. Is it fair to put all of it on Steel Venters? I personally don't think it is. I know he's playing and I know he's ready, but there's still an up-to-speed advantage of getting back into game reps after 2 years off. So when I look at Gonzaga and I look at the way that they're going to try and get themselves going, lots of good guards. Who's going to become great and who's going to become the perimeter explosive firepower that we're used to seeing with the Zags? I'm not sure we have the answer to that yet. Maybe it's just as simple as Tyon Grant-Foster does that and helps out his three-point percentage in the process. But beyond that, I think there's a lot of opportunity at stake, and there are a lot of guys with a lot of different variations, a lot of different solutions here that could come to the forefront.
All right. Well, that'll wrap us up as we have rolled through the scariest things about each WCC team heading into the season. Be sure to follow along on social media at unofficial WCC pod. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you listen. Go back and rewatch all of the media day coverage that we did last week. It's on the YouTube channel. You can go back and watch it there. It is also on all the streaming services as well. So
We will
you can
link
go
that.
back and go back through all those interviews and hear just like from the coaches and the players and whatnot and all of that. We will be back next week with the first game where we're going to talk about the game previews. We will actually have basketball happening in about a week. So we're obviously really pumped about that. Be sure to follow along, subscribe, do all the things you need to do to be ready for night 1 of the college basketball season next Monday. For Thomas, I'm Zach. Thanks for watching, everybody, and we will catch you later.